Dr. Jason Fung, cancer is caused by chronic damage to our cells.
Smoking and asbestos and soot and all these chemicals. So those are called carcinogens. And the question is, how do those carcinogens lead to cancer, and what is cancer? Because that's really the question. So of all the sort of major medical diseases, cancer is by far the most mysterious, because we've sort of figured out what causes a lot of disease. So we have infections and we have viruses. We have, if your arteries get blocked up, you get a heart attack or you get a stroke. So we figured it out. We really haven't figured out what is cancer, because cancer is not this extrinsic agent like a virus that comes in and attacks you. It's actually like a perversion of our own cell. So if you have lung cancer, that cancer is derived from your own originally normal lung cell. So what turned that cell, which is normal, like everybody has, and turned it into a cancer cell? And that's the really interesting part, because that's our thinking about that has changed over the years. So we initially thought of it as sort of a fluke, like it just happens for no reason. It just grows too much. So if it's a lung cancer and it grows too much, well, we're going to devise ways to kill it. So we have surgery, for example, we have radiation, we have chemotherapy, which is drugs. So that's the sort of classic, and that still sort of forms most of what we think about cancer treatments. But really, they're indiscriminate ways of killing people, right? So it's cutting, like surgery, it's burning with radiation, or it's poison, like chemotherapy. As we got into the 2000s, people started to think about genetics more and more. So we, cracked the genetic code, and then we got the Human Genome Project, which put out all the the entire genome of a human being. And then we said, okay, well, cancer is a disease where genetic mutations will change. So if you happen to have a chance genetic mutation in a gene that controls growth, well, that can cause you to grow too much. So then we started to look for genetic mutations, and it was initially very successful. And then we thought, well, if we simply look at the cancer, we can find the 2 or 3 genetic mutations, develop these drugs to target these mutations, and there, it's all done, right? And it worked well for the first little bit. So we developed a couple of drugs for breast cancer, for a type of leukemia, fantastically successful. But the problem was that as we started to look further and further into this genetic mutation model, we actually didn't get anywhere, because they didn't have 2 or 3 genetic mutations. They had like hundreds of mutations. So after the Human Genome Project, they did this Cancer Genome Atlas, where they sequenced thousands of cancers to find out what type of mutations there are. And it turns out that if you have one cancer, you might have 100 different genetic mutations, and the person next to you with the exact same cancer would have 100 completely different mutations. So all over the place. It was complete like bedlam. It couldn't make any heads or tails of it. But the important thing from that standpoint is that you can't treat that, because you can't get 100 different drugs for one person and 100 completely different drugs for the next person. It just isn't possible. So that sort of brought that whole genetic paradigm to a grinding halt. And that's where most people think we are, but we've actually gone much further than that. So we've gone the next step and said, well, if genes are mutating, we know they're mutating, what is driving this mutation? And it turns out it's likely an evolutionary process. So it's a response probably to chronic injury. As you get this chronic injury, like tobacco smoke, like radiation, your body starts to go back, and the cell becomes more primitive, more like a solitary, like a single-celled organism. That is, our bodies are composed of multiple cells, but we have to work as a team. So your lung has to work with your liver, right? And the liver, all the liver cells have to work in conjunction with blood cells and so on. So it's all a team. So cells have to cooperate with each other. When you get this sort of chronic damage to the cells, you basically lose this law and order, and what you get is like anarchy. So in this anarchy of the lung or the liver, or wherever you're getting this damage, the certain cells can sort of break off on their own and become like single-celled organism, which is much like, in a city where there's, total chaos, police have gone, you get looting and all this because everybody's looking out for themselves. So instead of cooperating with just these cells actually start to behave more and more like they're out, every cell for itself. And that's when it becomes dangerous because the cells who are out for themselves, they grow, right? Because that's what they want to do. They move all over the place, just like a bacteria will move all over the place. So these cells can metastasize, and there's no controls on this growth. So normally we control the growth of the liver very tightly. That is, the liver is a certain size and it won't grow any bigger. That paradigm is very powerful because it leads to sort of the next level in terms of what are treatments, which is now we're talking about immunotherapy, where what we want to do is not just indiscriminately kill, but we want to get, strengthen the immune system, sort of like a police force to go in there and hunt these bad cells, as opposed to indiscriminately killing everything, right? You're not trying to carpet bomb, cells into submission. What you're trying to do with immunotherapy is go in there and treat it.
How do carcinogens lead to cancer? What is cancer? Of all the major medical diseases, cancer is the most mysterious. We have figured out what causes a lot of diseases, infections, viruses, blocked arteries. But cancer is still the most mysterious. It is not an extrinsic agent like a virus that comes in and attacks. It is a perversion of our own cell. For example, lung cancer is derived from originally normal lung cell. What turned a normal cell into a cancer cell? The thinking on this has changed. Originally, experts just thought it was a fluke. They would say, it grows too much, so let's kill it by using surgery, cutting, radiation, burning, chemotherapy, drugs. Then, into the 2000s, people began to think about genetics more. We cracked the genetic code. We had the Human Genome Project, and it was thought cancer is a disease of genetic mutations. If we look at the cancers and find the 2 or 3 genetic mutations and develop drugs to target these, that would be great. And it worked well in the beginning for breast cancer and one type of leukemia. But as we got further into the genetic mutation model, however, we did not get anywhere. We did not have 2 or 3 genetic mutations, but hundreds. The Cancer Genome Atlas Project sequenced thousands of cancers and found one person's cancer might have 100 genetic mutations, while another person with the same cancer would have 100 completely different ones. You can't treat that. You can't create 100 different drugs for each patient. This brought the genetic paradigm to a halt. So, Dr. Fung says that researchers thought, if genes are mutating, what is driving this? It's likely an evolutionary response to chronic injuries like tobacco smoke, radiation. The cell becomes more primitive, like a single-cell organism. Our bodies are multiple cell organisms, and so the cells must work together as a team. The cells must cooperate with each other. When you get chronic damage in an organ, you get anarchy. Damaged cells can break off on their own. These cells that break off on their own, like primitive single-cell organisms, they stop cooperating. They begin behaving like every cell for itself. That is when it is dangerous, because these damaged cells grow and grow. They can move all over. They can metastasize. They're out of control. This paradigm is very powerful. It tells us we want to strengthen the immune system. That way it can go in and hunt bad cells instead of indiscriminately killing cells.